The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees Celsius on the morning of December 19, 1944, when Oberst Heinrich Vogel received the field telephone call that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. His forward observation post near the village of Kreuzberg in the Belgian Ardennes had gone silent 20 minutes earlier. Now, through the crackling static of the field line, came the voice of his communications officer, barely audible over what sounded like a continuous mechanical roar punctuated by the distinctive hammering of heavy machine guns. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Vogel pressed the receiver harder against his ear, straining to understand the fragmented report. What he heard made no tactical sense whatsoever. His officer was describing American vehicles, not tanks but something lighter, moving across frozen fields at speeds that seemed impossible for the terrain. These vehicles were firing continuously while in motion, their machine guns cutting down German infantry who had no cover, no time to establish defensive positions, no chance to return effective fire. In less than 18 minutes, an entire company of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, over 300 veteran soldiers, had been effectively destroyed not by American armor or artillery, but by what the panicked officer kept calling those damned rolling gun platforms. Vogel had heard the intelligence briefings about American half-tracks. His superiors had dismissed them as glorified trucks, thin-skinned transport vehicles useful only for moving troops to the battlefield but worthless in actual combat. The vehicles carried armor plating so minimal that standard rifle fire could penetrate it. They lacked the protection of proper armored fighting vehicles. German tactical doctrine classified them as targets of opportunity, easy prey for determined infantry with Panzerfausts or even concentrated small arms fire. Yet the report coming through his field telephone described something entirely different. These half-tracks were not retreating or seeking cover. They were attacking, advancing across open ground in coordinated formations, their multiple machine guns creating interlocking fields of fire that resembled nothing so much as mobile kill zones. Before Vogel could formulate orders, the line went dead. The forward observation post never reported again. When German forces finally recaptured the position 3 days later, they found the communications bunker intact but empty. The defenders had fled. Scattered across the frozen fields beyond lay the bodies of 270 German soldiers, cut down in neat rows that testified to methodical, devastating fire discipline from moving platforms. The snow was churned into red slush across an area spanning nearly 400 meters. Not a single American half-track had been destroyed or even disabled in the engagement. This was not the first such incident, nor would it be the last. Across the winter battlefields of the Ardennes, the Rhineland, and eventually into Germany itself, similar reports accumulated with disturbing consistency. German commanders who had laughed at intelligence photographs of American half-tracks, who had joked about the thin armor and open tops, who had assumed these vehicles represented American industrial excess producing militarily useless equipment, were discovering a terrible truth. The Americans had not built transport vehicles. They had built weapons platforms of devastating effectiveness, mobile machine gun nests that could relocate faster than German infantry could react, that could pursue retreating forces, that could establish and break through defensive positions with a speed and firepower that traditional military doctrine had never anticipated. The origins of German contempt for American half-tracks traced back to the earliest intelligence assessments conducted in late 1942 and early 1943. When reconnaissance units first obtained clear photographs of the M3 half-track personnel carrier, German armor experts gathered at the testing grounds in Kummersdorf subjected the images to detailed analysis. What they saw confirmed every preconception about American military equipment. The vehicle appeared to represent American industrial philosophy at its most wasteful and impractical. Hauptmann Wolfgang Steiner, an armor specialist who had spent 5 years evaluating enemy vehicles, prepared the initial assessment that would shape German understanding of the half-track for the next 2 years. His report, dated March 7, 1943, revealed the depth of German misunderstanding. The American M3 half-track represents a curious hybrid that achieves neither the mobility of a truck nor the protection of an armored vehicle. The front armor measures only 12 mm, insufficient to stop even standard rifle ammunition at close range. The sides are protected by mere 6 mm of steel plate. Most critically, the crew compartment is completely open at the top, leaving occupants vulnerable to artillery fragments, grenades, and overhead fire. Steiner's analysis continued with what seemed like damning observations about the vehicle's tactical limitations. The Halftracks' ground pressure, while better than wheeled vehicles, cannot match that of tracked vehicles. Its cross-country mobility will be severely limited in muddy or heavily cratered terrain. The combination of tracks in the rear and wheels in the front creates mechanical complexity without corresponding tactical advantage. A proper tracked vehicle would provide superior mobility. A proper wheeled vehicle would be simpler and cheaper to produce. This hybrid achieves the disadvantages of both with the advantages of neither. The report concluded with an assessment that would be repeated throughout the German military establishment for the next year. The American half-track appears to be a product of industrial excess rather than tactical thinking. The United States, possessing vast manufacturing capacity, has created an expensive and mechanically complex vehicle to perform tasks that could be accomplished more effectively by either trucks or proper armored personnel carriers. This vehicle represents American production philosophy, impressive in scale but questionable in practical military value. We recommend classifying half-tracks as soft-skinned vehicles for targeting purposes. They should be engaged with the same weapons and tactics effective against trucks and other unarmored transport. This assessment was accepted without question by the German General Staff. The half-track joined a growing list of American equipment that German planners viewed as evidence of industrial wastefulness rather than military capability. Just as they had initially dismissed the Sherman tank as inferior to German armor, just as they had scoffed at American reliance on air transport, German commanders assumed that half-tracks represented another example of American preference for quantity over quality, mass production over tactical effectiveness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What German analysts had failed to consider was the intended purpose of the half-track within American tactical doctrine. The vehicle had never been designed to replace tanks or serve as a primary armored fighting vehicle. Instead, it represented something fundamentally different, a platform that combined mobility, firepower, and protection in proportions optimized for a specific role that German military thinking had never seriously contemplated. The Americans were not trying to build a light tank or an armored car. They were building mobile fire support platforms that could keep pace with advancing armor, suppress enemy positions, provide covering fire for infantry assaults, and rapidly relocate to respond to changing tactical situations. The M3 half-track typically mounted a 50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun and a ring mount at the front of the crew compartment. Many variants added 1 or 2 30 caliber Browning M1919 machine guns on pintle mounts along the sides. This combination provided devastating firepower against infantry, unarmored vehicles, and light fortifications. The 50 caliber weapon could penetrate light armor at close range and had an effective range exceeding 1,800 meters. The 30 caliber guns could sustain rates of fire approaching 500 rounds per minute. A single half-track could deliver more sustained firepower than an entire German infantry platoon, and it could deliver that firepower while moving at speeds up to 70 km per hour on roads, 40 km per hour cross-country. The armor, while light by tank standards, proved entirely adequate for the vehicle's intended role. 12 mm of frontal armor provided protection against small arms fire and shell fragments at combat ranges. The open top, far from being a vulnerability, allowed crew members to observe the battlefield and direct fire without the limited vision inherent in enclosed vehicles. The crew could quickly dismount if the tactical situation required, or remain mobile and protected while engaging targets at distances beyond the effective range of most infantry weapons. German intelligence officers, viewing photographs and studying captured examples, consistently failed to grasp the tactical implications of these design choices. They saw a vehicle with light armor and assumed vulnerability. They saw an open crew compartment and assumed it was a transport vehicle. They noted the relatively simple armament and assumed limited combat effectiveness. What they missed was the fundamental concept behind the design. The half-track was never intended to stand and fight against heavy opposition. It was designed to provide mobile firepower, to arrive suddenly, deliver devastating fire, and relocate before enemy forces could organize an effective response. Throughout 1943 and into early 1944, German after-action reports from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy mention half-tracks primarily in passing, as elements of American motor columns or as transport vehicles accompanying tank formations. There were scattered references to half-track mounted machine guns providing fire support during attacks, but these were noted without particular emphasis. German tactical doctrine focused on countering American tanks and tank destroyers, which represented clear threats to German defensive positions. Half-tracks, when they appeared in German planning documents at all, were classified alongside trucks and jeeps as secondary targets, vehicles to be engaged after more pressing threats had been neutralized. This dismissive attitude was reinforced by early encounters where German forces successfully knocked out half-tracks with anti-tank weapons or destroyed them with artillery fire. Oberleutnant Karl Richter, commanding a company of Panzergrenadiers in Italy during the autumn of 1943, reported destroying 4 American half-tracks in a single engagement near Monte Cassino. His report, which circulated through the Wehrmacht as confirmation of the vehicle's vulnerability, described a straightforward action. American half-tracks attempted to advance across open ground in support of an infantry attack. My men engaged them with Panzerfausts at ranges under 100 meters. 3 vehicles were destroyed immediately, the 4th disabled and abandoned by its crew. The thin armor provided no protection against shaped charge warheads. The open crew compartments allowed us to engage the vehicle commanders with rifle fire before launching anti-tank weapons. These vehicles posed minimal threat to properly positioned infantry. What Richter's report failed to mention was that the half-tracks in question had been advancing slowly across difficult terrain, constrained by the narrow mountain roads and unable to maneuver. They had been employed essentially as stationary gun platforms, not as mobile fire support. The tactical situation bore no resemblance to the open terrain engagements where half-tracks would demonstrate their true effectiveness. Yet Richter's report, and others like it, reinforced the prevailing German assessment that half-tracks were vulnerable targets rather than dangerous weapons systems. The disconnect between German assumptions and American tactical employment of half-tracks reflected a broader failure of German military intelligence in the latter half of the war. German analysts had developed frameworks for understanding enemy equipment based on their own tactical doctrines and operational experiences. When they encountered vehicles or weapons that did not fit these frameworks, they tended to dismiss them as inferior or misapplied rather than questioning whether their own frameworks might be incomplete. The half-track represented a category of vehicle that German doctrine had never seriously considered, a platform optimized for sustained mobile firepower rather than either transport or direct combat. German military thought had evolved from experiences on the Eastern Front, where vast distances and poor infrastructure placed premiums on cross-country mobility and mechanical reliability. German armored doctrine emphasized the employment of heavy tanks as breakthrough weapons, supported by mechanized infantry and armored personnel carriers designed to keep pace with tanks across difficult terrain. The ideal German armored personnel carrier, exemplified by the SD, KFC 251, was fully tracked for maximum cross-country mobility, carried infantry squad-sized elements, and mounted minimal armament since its primary purpose was transport rather than combat. The American approach reflected different tactical priorities. American doctrine assumed reasonable road networks would be available in most theaters of operation. American armored formations emphasized speed and operational tempo over the grinding positional warfare that characterized much of the Eastern Front. American infantry tactics relied heavily on suppressive fire to enable maneuver, requiring sustained firepower that squad-level weapons could not provide. The half-track emerged as a solution to these distinctly American tactical requirements, a vehicle that could rapidly deploy overwhelming firepower, reposition quickly, and maintain sustained fire while infantry maneuvered. Throughout the first half of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, German intelligence continued to dismiss half-tracks as militarily insignificant. Planning documents for the defense of France devoted extensive analysis to countering American and British tanks, calculating optimal placement of anti-tank guns, planning firing positions for panzers, developing tactics for infantry anti-tank teams. Halftracks merited barely a footnote in these extensive preparations. When they appeared in German tactical guidance at all, it was with recommendations to engage them with the same weapons effective against trucks and other soft-skinned vehicles. This proved to be one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the German defensive preparations. When American forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, and began pushing inland through the Bocage country of northwestern France, Halftracks played a central role in American tactical success. The hedgerow terrain of Normandy, with its patchwork of small fields bordered by thick vegetation and earth embankments, created ideal conditions for defensive warfare. German infantry could establish positions in hedgerows with excellent fields of fire across the approaches, forcing American forces to attack across open ground under heavy fire. Traditional tactics would have required lengthy artillery preparation followed by infantry assault, a slow and costly process. American forces instead developed techniques that exploited the mobility and firepower of halftracks. Groups of 2 to 4 vehicles would advance rapidly across fields, their multiple machine guns suppressing German positions while American infantry used the covering fire to close distance and flank defensive positions. The halftracks could absorb considerable small arms fire that would have pinned down infantry, and their mobility allowed them to relocate rapidly if encountering anti-tank weapons. German defenders, expecting to face infantry assaults supported by distant artillery, instead confronted mobile gun platforms that could deliver artillery-level firepower at point-blank range. The psychological impact was substantial. German infantry dug into hedgerow positions found themselves under sustained, accurate machine gun fire from multiple directions as halftracks maneuvered around their flanks. The distinctive sound of 50 caliber machine guns, deeper and more menacing than rifle-caliber weapons, became associated with American attacks. Veterans of the Eastern Front, accustomed to Soviet mass infantry assaults supported by occasional armor, found the American combination of mobility and firepower profoundly disorienting. Yet even these engagements in Normandy failed to fully alert German high command to the tactical significance of halftracks. After-action reports focused on American numerical superiority, artillery dominance, and air support. When halftracks were mentioned, it was typically as elements supporting more significant threats. The true revelation of half-track effectiveness, the engagement that would finally shatter German dismissiveness and force a complete reassessment of these vehicles, would come during the winter campaigns of late 1944, in terrain and conditions that seemed to favor German defensive tactics but instead provided the perfect demonstration of mobile firepower's devastating potential. The breakthrough that forced German commanders to fundamentally reconsider their assessment of American half-tracks came not through gradual accumulation of evidence but through a series of catastrophic engagements during the opening days of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. German planners had assumed that winter conditions, rough terrain, and surprise would overwhelm American defensive positions before mobile reinforcements could arrive. What they encountered instead was a defensive response built around the rapid deployment of half-track mounted machine gun units that could reach threatened sectors faster than German forces could exploit their initial breakthroughs. General Major Hans Dietrich commanded the reconnaissance elements of the 2nd Panzer Division tasked with penetrating American lines near the town of Houffalize. His forces achieved complete surprise on the morning of December 16, overrunning American forward positions and advancing nearly 8 kilometers by midday. Dietrich's after-action report, submitted 3 days later from a field hospital where he was recovering from wounds, described what happened when American forces counterattacked that afternoon. We anticipated infantry reinforcements supported by tanks would require hours to arrive and organize a coordinated response. Instead, within 90 minutes of our initial breakthrough, we encountered American half-tracks advancing in company strength, approximately 12 vehicles moving in loose formation across the open field south of our penetration. Dietrich had initially ordered his infantry to establish hasty defensive positions, confident that light anti-tank weapons would suffice against what he still considered transport vehicles. His report continued with a description that revealed the full extent of German miscalculation. The half-tracks did not approach cautiously as we expected. They advanced at high speed, perhaps 50 kilometers per hour, spreading into a wide arc that threatened to envelop our forward elements. At approximately 400 meters distance, they opened fire while still moving. The volume of fire was extraordinary. Each vehicle appeared to mount multiple heavy machine guns, and they fired continuously without pausing to aim or adjust. The effect on my infantry was immediate and devastating. The German soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front accustomed to Soviet tactics, found themselves facing something entirely unfamiliar. Soviet counterattacks typically involved massed infantry supported by artillery barrages, attacks that were predictable and could be met with established defensive tactics. The American half-track assault bore no resemblance to this pattern. The vehicles moved too quickly for German infantry to organize concentrated anti-tank fire. Their machine guns created overlapping fields of fire that made it impossible for German soldiers to remain in exposed positions. Troops attempting to maneuver their Panzerfausts into effective range found themselves under fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Dietrich's report described the tactical problem with remarkable clarity. Our soldiers could not establish firing positions without being suppressed by machine gun fire from vehicles that remained in constant motion. When squads attempted to coordinate anti-tank ambushes, the half-tracks would detect the movement and concentrate fire on those positions while other vehicles maneuvered to flank them. The coordination between vehicles suggested careful training and practiced tactics. Within minutes, my forward companies had taken casualties exceeding 30%. The survivors were pinned in place, unable to advance or effectively return fire. When I ordered a withdrawal to more defensible positions, the half-tracks pursued, maintaining contact and continuing to inflict casualties on troops attempting to disengage. The engagement lasted approximately 40 minutes. When German forces finally established a defensive line anchored by anti-tank guns and supported by armor, the American half-tracks withdrew without attempting to press the attack further. Dietrich's reconnaissance battalion had suffered 360 casualties, the majority inflicted by half-track mounted machine guns. Not a single American half-track had been destroyed, though several showed evidence of small arms impacts that had failed to penetrate the armor or disable the vehicles. The German penetration that had advanced 8 kilometers in 6 hours had been pushed back nearly 5 kilometers in less than an hour of contact with mobile American firepower. Similar reports flooded German headquarters throughout the first week of the Ardennes offensive. Near Bastogne, Oberst Heinrich Vogel reported losing an entire infantry company to half-track fire in an engagement lasting barely 20 minutes. His forces had been advancing through a river valley when American half-tracks appeared on the ridgelines on both sides, creating a deadly crossfire that German troops could neither escape nor effectively counter. Near St. Vith, Major Werner Schultz described half-tracks operating in coordination with American armor, the tracked vehicles providing sustained suppressive fire that prevented German anti-tank teams from engaging the tanks while the tanks destroyed German strongpoints that might threaten the half-tracks. The tactical pattern was consistent across these engagements. American forces used half-tracks as mobile fire support platforms, exploiting their speed to rapidly concentrate overwhelming firepower at critical points. The vehicles operated in coordinated groups, typically 4 to 8 half-tracks working together to create interlocking fields of fire. They avoided static defensive positions where German anti-tank weapons could target them effectively, instead maintaining constant motion that made aimed fire difficult while their own machine guns swept German positions with sustained bursts. When German forces attempted to mass infantry for counterattacks, half-tracks would appear suddenly, their concentrated machine gun fire breaking up formations before they could close to effective range. The psychological impact on German infantry proved as significant as the physical casualties. Soldiers who had faced Soviet armor without breaking found themselves demoralized by vehicles they had been told were insignificant targets. The sound of multiple heavy machine guns firing simultaneously, combined with the sight of vehicles advancing at high speed while maintaining accurate fire, created an impression of unstoppable mechanical violence. German infantry began reporting half-track sightings with the same concern they reserved for tank encounters, requesting artillery or anti-tank support to deal with vehicles their training had classified as soft targets. Oberst Martin Krebs, operations officer for the 116th Panzer Division, attempted to analyze the tactical problem in a report dated December 23, 1944. The American half-track represents a weapons system we failed to properly categorize. We assessed these vehicles as transport with secondary combat capability. In practice, they function as highly mobile machine gun platforms optimized for suppressing infantry and supporting combined arms operations. Their thin armor, which we considered a vulnerability, proves adequate against infantry weapons at typical engagement ranges. Their open crew compartments, which we assumed would make crews vulnerable, actually provide superior situational awareness compared to enclosed vehicles. Most significantly, their speed and mobility allow them to concentrate firepower rapidly at critical points, creating local superiority even when overall force ratios favor our forces. Krebs identified several specific tactical advantages that German planners had overlooked. The half-track's combination of wheels and tracks provides better road speed than fully tracked vehicles while maintaining reasonable cross-country mobility. This allows rapid strategic movement on roads followed by tactical deployment off-road, a combination our doctrine did not anticipate. The vehicle's relatively simple design appears to allow for rapid field repairs and high mechanical reliability. American units demonstrate the ability to maintain high operational readiness rates even under difficult conditions. The mounting of multiple machine guns provides redundancy. Even if one weapon is disabled, the vehicle retains significant combat capability. The report concluded with recommendations that represented a complete reversal of earlier German assessments. Half-tracks should be engaged with the same priority as armored fighting vehicles. Anti-tank weapons should be allocated to counter half-track threats even when heavier armor is not present. Infantry positions should be sited to provide protection against mobile machine gun fire, not merely against direct assault. Artillery and mortar fire should target concentrations of half-tracks with the same urgency as tank formations. Air support, when available, should be directed against half-track units operating in support of American advances. These recommendations came too late to influence German defensive planning in the Ardennes, and by the time they were distributed to frontline units, the offensive had already failed. The lesson, however, had been learned through bitter experience. Throughout January and February 1945, as German forces withdrew across the Rhineland, half-tracks played an increasingly prominent role in American pursuit operations. The vehicles proved ideal for exploitation, moving rapidly to cut off German withdrawal routes, establishing blocking positions that German infantry could not dislodge, and maintaining contact with retreating forces to prevent them from establishing new defensive lines. Major Ernst Hoffmann commanded a battalion of the 89th Infantry Division during the fighting withdrawal across the Eifel region in February 1945. His diary entries provide vivid descriptions of attempting to conduct a tactical retreat while under constant pressure from American half-track units. February 12. We began the day attempting to establish a defensive line along the ridge overlooking the Prum River. Before positions could be properly prepared, American half-tracks appeared from three directions. The vehicles moved too quickly for our anti-tank teams to establish effective ambush positions. We were forced to abandon the ridge after suffering severe casualties. The half-tracks pursued our withdrawal, maintaining contact and preventing us from establishing alternate positions. We have now withdrawn 8 kilometers in 6 hours, a pace that leaves exhausted men vulnerable to capture or isolated destruction. Hoffmann's entries over the following days described a pattern of continuous pressure that prevented effective defense. February 14, attempted to hold village of Niederweis. American half-tracks bypassed the village and established roadblock positions on our intended withdrawal route. We were forced to abandon heavy equipment and withdraw cross-country through difficult terrain. Casualties from machine gun fire continue to mount. Men are beginning to surrender rather than face another encounter with the mobile gun platforms. February 16. Our battalion has been reduced to approximately 40% effective strength. The majority of casualties have been inflicted not by artillery or tank fire but by half-track mounted machine guns during movement or attempted defense. The vehicles appear wherever we attempt to establish positions, arriving before we can properly prepare defenses and withdrawing before we can organize effective counterfire. The cumulative effect of these experiences transformed German tactical thinking about American mobile firepower. Officers who survived the winter campaigns of 1944 and 1945 developed profound respect for vehicles they had initially dismissed as militarily insignificant. The half-track came to symbolize a broader reality about American tactical doctrine that German commanders had been slow to recognize. American forces did not rely primarily on tactical brilliance or operational excellence. They relied on overwhelming material superiority applied through doctrine that emphasized speed, firepower, and the systematic exploitation of mobility advantages. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded various formations during the fighting in France and Germany, reflected on this transformation in testimony provided to American interrogators after the war. "We entered the campaign in France believing we understood American tactical methods. We had studied reports from North Africa and Italy. We knew the Americans relied heavily on artillery and air support. We knew they preferred firepower to maneuver. What we failed to grasp was the degree to which American doctrine had been built around mechanical mobility." The half-track exemplified this approach. It was not a sophisticated weapon system. It was a simple platform that combined adequate protection with substantial firepower and excellent mobility. American forces used these vehicles to implement tactics that our doctrine had never seriously considered. Bayerlein identified what he considered the fundamental German error in assessing the half-track. "We evaluated it against German vehicles designed for similar purposes and found it wanting. The half-track had less armor than our armored personnel carriers, less mobility than our reconnaissance vehicles, less firepower than our light tanks. By every metric we considered important, the vehicle appeared inferior. What we missed was that the Americans were not trying to match German vehicles in any specific category. They were creating a tool optimized for their doctrine of mobile suppressive fire. They accepted limited protection because the vehicle would not remain stationary long enough to be effectively targeted. They accepted open crew compartments because observation and rapid response mattered more than overhead protection. They accepted simple armament because volume of fire mattered more than individual weapon capability." The transformation of German respect for American half-tracks was perhaps most clearly demonstrated in the allocation of German defensive resources during the final months of the war. By March 1945, German tactical guidance for defensive positions included specific procedures for countering half-track attacks. Anti-tank weapons were to be positioned to cover likely half-track approaches with the same care given to defending against armor. Infantry positions were to be sighted to provide mutual support against mobile machine gun fire. Withdrawal routes were to be planned with consideration for the speed at which American half-tracks could pursue and establish blocking positions. These preparations came too late and with insufficient resources to significantly affect the outcome, but they represented acknowledgement of a tactical reality that German commanders had dismissed for years. The final accounting of German casualties inflicted by American half-tracks remains imprecise, as battlefield records from the chaotic final months of the war are incomplete and inconsistent. Conservative estimates suggest that half-track mounted weapons accounted for at least 8,000 German combat casualties during the campaigns in Northwest Europe from June 1944 through May 1945, with the majority occurring during the mobile warfare of the final 6 months. This figure includes only direct casualties from half-track weapons, not secondary effects such as soldiers killed or wounded when half-tracks enabled other American forces to exploit breakthroughs or cut off retreating units. The broader significance of the half-track's effectiveness lay not in the raw casualty figures but in what it revealed about the nature of modern mechanized warfare. German military doctrine had been built around concepts of operational maneuver and tactical excellence, assuming that superior training and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages. The half-track demonstrated the limitations of this approach. American forces did not need to outmaneuver German defenders or execute tactically brilliant operations. They simply needed to arrive quickly with overwhelming firepower and apply that firepower systematically. The half-track provided exactly this capability, a platform that transformed American material advantages into tactical reality at the point of contact. Oberst Lieutenant Klaus Weber, who served as a tactical instructor at the Wehrmacht Training Center in Dobritz before being assigned to combat duty in late 1944, attempted to incorporate lessons about half-tracks into updated tactical guidance issued in March 1945. His manual, titled Defense Against American Mobile Fire Support, represented the most comprehensive German analysis of half-track tactics produced during the war. The document acknowledged the vehicle's effectiveness while attempting to identify tactical countermeasures that German forces might employ with their dwindling resources. American half-track tactics exploit three primary advantages: speed of deployment, volume of sustained fire, and coordination with other arms. Effective defense requires denying or negating each of these advantages. Obstacles and demolitions can slow half-track movement, forcing vehicles into predictable avenues of approach where anti-tank weapons can be effectively employed. Dispersed defensive positions reduce the effectiveness of concentrated machine gun fire. Closed terrain limits half-track mobility and reduces the effectiveness of their primary armament. Weber's manual included detailed recommendations for engaging half-tracks with available German weapons. The document noted that standard infantry weapons had proven largely ineffective against half-tracks at typical engagement ranges, but identified specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited under favorable conditions. The vehicle's open crew compartment makes it vulnerable to plunging fire from elevated positions. Mortar or artillery fire, when available, can inflict casualties on vehicle crews and potentially disable weapons. Panzerfausts remain effective at close range, particularly when fired at the vehicle's tracks or engine compartment. Coordinated fire from multiple positions can force half-tracks to button up or withdraw, reducing their effectiveness. The manual's most significant insight concerned the operational rather than tactical implications of half-track effectiveness. The American ability to rapidly deploy mobile firepower fundamentally alters the temporal dynamics of defensive operations. Traditional doctrine assumed defenders would have hours or even days to prepare positions before facing coordinated attacks. American half-track doctrine compresses this timeline to minutes. Defensive positions must be prepared to engage mobile threats immediately upon their appearance, without time for reconnaissance, coordination, or deliberate preparation. This requirement places unprecedented demands on unit readiness and responsiveness that our current force structure and training cannot adequately meet. This assessment, produced in the final weeks of the war when German forces were collapsing on all fronts, represented the ultimate acknowledgement of how thoroughly German commanders had misunderstood American equipment and doctrine. The officers who had laughed at intelligence photographs of thin-skinned half-tracks in 1943 were by 1945 treating these vehicles as priority threats requiring the same defensive resources allocated to heavy armor. The transformation had required thousands of casualties, dozens of failed defensive operations, and repeated demonstrations of tactical effectiveness that could no longer be dismissed or ignored. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.